And it's Tuesday, which puts us one day closer to Friday. Tuesday, August the 12th, 2025. Thank you for being here as we continue or sort of, get our study underway here of Paul Copan's book, True for You, But Not for Me. And the edition, remember, that I'm using is the revised edition that I'm using here. I have my Dead Tree edition here from 1998. That this one actually has discussion questions in it that I'll be using throughout the study, but for some reason the electronic edition doesn't have them. I don't know why. But anyway, hit that subscribe bar and then the notification bell when it comes up so you can be notified when content is added to the channel. Comment on these videos, like these videos, share these videos. Check out my Patreon page if you'd like to help support the work of this channel. And as soon as I get the exclusive content issue figured out, that'll be over there. We're just working on that. And then Substack, publish over there at least once a week, working on some things right now that should be up there in the next day or so. And I receive no compensation, royalties, any consideration from the author or publishers of this book. I'm just conducting the study because I like the book and the subject matter interests me. So now, as I said, the what I call the Dead Tree edition, or the paper and ink copy, has got the discussion questions for each chapter in it. I don't know why the Logos electronic version doesn't have the questions, but it didn't have them. At least I couldn't find them in there anyway, and I did some searches. But anyway, the discussion questions here in this book are going to be used as the basis for a lot of our discussion as we go through the chapters in the book. Now, Chapter 1, there's basically two discussion questions that Copan has. Number one, what does it mean when we say that relativism is self-defeating? And then what relativists commit, or rather, when relativists commit the self-accepting fallacy, what are they doing? And so let's take a look at the chapters here. We'll start with take the first question first. Now, on its surface, relativism sounds relaxed and easygoing, and that's true. When you think about, okay, so Christianity, what was the expression I heard? Oh, it's not your jam, it's mine. Okay, that's cool. You go on your way and I'll go on mine and we'll just agree to disagree. Now, from a legal First Amendment standpoint, that's not a problem. But when it comes to actual scriptural biblical truth, that becomes an issue. Now, when you think through relativism and its implications and you start really applying it to life, well, here's what Alistair McGrath said. He said, it is utterly wrong-headed to say that something is true for you but not for me. For example, what if I think fascism is true and you think liberal democracy is equally true? Should the fascist repression be tolerated by the believer in liberal democracy? If not, on what grounds? Why not permit Stalinism or Satanism or Nazism? Without criteria to determine truth, this relativism fails miserably. So, see, right there is a problem. There are a lot, still are. In fact, I was just watching a video. I'm starting to put together, I think I'll do a my 2 cents worth on a town out in Idaho where you've got actual, real, live, basically Nazis, white supremacists. So, if all truth is going to be relative, why can what they say not be true? You see, it gets into a little bit of a problem because most people who are sane and sensible don't believe in the idea of any one race being superior to another, but there's some in all races who do. Racism crosses all lines. Anybody can be a racist. Now, most of us don't want to live in a world like we were just talking about. And relativism isn't just offensive emotionally. This is Copan's remarks, by the way, but it also doesn't hang together logically as a worldview. It cannot be sustained. And so in that case, as Copan says, page 26, you've got to become a selective relativist. So in other words, at some point, you're going to have to say morality is right, or this is right, or this is wrong. You've got to have an absolute standard. This is interesting. I'd never thought of this. Titus chapter 1, verse 12. Titus, remember, was a young evangelist who was left on the Isle of Crete to set things in order, appoint elders, and that sort of thing. Paul's writing to him to try and encourage him in his work. Paul says, even one of their own prophets has said, Cretans are always liars, evil brutes, lazy gluttons, And when I was growing up, cretin would occasionally be used to insult somebody or to say somebody had bad character. Oh, that guy is such a cretin. He's got bad character. He's a liar. Watch out for that guy. Well, what Paul said, or rather, what Paul said there is a quote from a Cretan philosopher named Epimenides, Epimenides, lived around the 6th century BC. So one of their own prophets has said they're always liars, evil brutes, and that sort of thing. Now, Paul Copeland points out, do you see the irony there? You've got one of their own calling them a bunch of liars, calling Cretans a bunch of liars. So is he telling the truth when he says they're all liars? Can that guy be trusted when he calls his own people liars, or is he lying, or is he exaggerating? Anyway, relativism, Copeland says, claims to speak universal truth about at least one thing, namely that someone's truth can be someone else's falsehood. And thus it contradicts itself by claiming that nothing is true or false. So why believe the relativist if he has no truth to mention? If nothing can be true, why should I believe him? A relativist's claims are like saying I can't speak a word of English. Well, that's nonsense because I've been speaking English the whole time. Or if you say all generalizations are false. Wait a minute, isn't that a generalization? So to be consistent, the relative has to say nothing is objectively true, including my own position. So you're free to accept it or reject it. And normally when a relativist would say everything is relative, he expects his hearers just to accept it, to embrace it. Oh yeah, you know what, that makes sense. But he doesn't stop to think about the contradiction that he has. And that leads us to this question. When a relativist commits the self-accepting fallacy, what's he doing? So the relativist doesn't believe his relativistic position is true simply for himself. He's going to believe it's true for everybody. I kind of liken this to the do as I say, not as I do, that some leaders have for their subordinates. So how come, boss, you took a 20-minute break, but you limit me to a 15-minute coffee break? Do as I say, not as I do. Okay, so the relativist is committing this error of the self-accepting fallacy. He's claiming a statement will hold true for everybody else, but doesn't necessarily hold true for me. So the relativist is unwilling to relativize his own relativism. Well, that starts to get confusing because he's making himself to be an exception to the rule. So the idea that something can be true for one person but false for another fails to meet its own criteria for truth. So think about it. A worldview can be internally consistent or logical, yet it can still be false. No worldview can be true if it contradicts. Nothing can be true if it contradicts itself. I can't be sitting here in my office while at the same time I'm out in the yard. I'm one or the other, especially since I'm on the second floor. So how is our sort of relativist inconsistent? Well, he arbitrarily sets down this one absolute, and absolutely no more. He knows humans always make mistakes, of course, excluding himself. And that's something you really got to be careful about when it comes to mistakes. Now, remember, a mistake is not necessarily a lie. You can make an honest mistake, and it's not a lie or a sin or anything. And the relativist is able to detect many mistakes and errors, but presumably knows many true things in order to achieve this detection. So he's got some standard for truth. And then a relativist believes that laws of logic are universally binding, which is why he wants to avoid contradiction. Everybody should want to avoid contradiction. And then the relativist assumes his mind is in working order, enabling him to detect errors. Paradox versus contradiction. No, we're not talking about two oxen pulling a plow. I know, lame joke. But what is the difference between a contradiction and a paradox? On the surface, they can both look the same. But the relativist idea that it's just a paradox you have to live with as opposed to a contradiction is kind of interesting. Now, even the relativists will be concerned about avoiding contradiction, and here is the difference. A paradox involves tensions or categories not easily unified or resolved, but there is a resolution, there is an answer. A contradiction renders itself incoherent. The truth is that there is no truth. That's a contradiction. And such evasions and distortions don't form a rationally serious argument. So here's some examples of a paradox. The only constant is change. Well, constant is something that's unchanging or implies it. Whereas change means something is always altering, always changing. You have to spend money to make money. Well, it implies you've got to incur a loss in order to gain something. This might be, for instance, paying for advertising for a new product, getting a line of credit or a loan from a bank so I can go and buy a piece of land and put a restaurant on it. I've got to have that money in order to get the facilities that I need so I can open my restaurant and then start making money. By the way, you know how you make $1 million in the restaurant business, don't you? You start with $2 million. Anyway, because, as we note here, he's counting on his belongings not being stolen, his Jaguar not having a sledgehammer taken to it. Jaguars are ugly cars anyway. I wouldn't own one. Anyway. And still, it's all relative when it comes to chastity or income tax reporting, but what if someone violates his rights? It's interesting how typically studies show that wealthy people think there should be stricter punishments for welfare fraud than for income tax evasion. But if you go to the poorer neighborhoods and you ask the same questions, you're going to get the exact opposite answer. Speaking of paradoxes, is that a paradox? And then it comes down to the idea of tolerance. Some of them, and this is just an observation, some of the most intolerant people that I have known over the years are the ones advocating for tolerance. Because why? Well, because they'll be tolerant if you agree with them, but once you stop agreeing with them, well, all of a sudden that's a problem. And so if relativism is correct, really rights don't exist. Because a relativist living under the Taliban's tyranny, as the example that Copen uses, wouldn't be saying your rules are true for you, but not for me. He would know that his rights are being violated because he's under oppression at that point. And you're not going to get away with trying to debate this with somebody at the Taliban. They think they're right, and they will execute you if you disagree with them. So summarizing this, if my belief is true only for me, why isn't your belief true only for you? Aren't you saying that you want me to believe the same way you do? Now, if you say no belief is true for everyone, you're making a universal claim that relativism is true and absolutism is false, and then you got a problem to explain that. You can't in the same breath say nothing is universally true, but then turn around and say, well, my view is universally true. And then the relativist applies his view to everyone but himself. Again, do as I say, not as I do. And that's a self-accepting fallacy. So the relativist who says that there's just one absolute, that everything is relative, or everything else is relative, rather, must address a host of inconsistencies. You got a whole of these inconsistencies here you've got to address. And then the relativists who call their view paradoxical presupposes the absoluteness of logic. They just don't want to be guilty of a contradiction. So as we go into chapter 2 at this point, how so many people disagree, therefore relativism must be true. Well, think back to the car. We used this yesterday, the car accident scenario. That if in any accident, everyone has a slightly different view of what's happened. So if we're standing on the corner, you're on one, I'd say there's 4 people, one on each corner, we're going to have a little bit different view of what happened in this accident. But a relativist will commit an error when they confuse the difficulty of finding the truth with the possibility of discerning truth or affirming its existence. Sometimes truth does take some digging. Okay, what happened in this accident? Mr. Smith, would you give me your statement? Okay, Mr. Jones, and we go around. And there might be some differences. And I took my driver's ed. I had a driver's ed course that my mother got me once, and I also had the school driver's ed course. But the one that I took downtown, so to speak, was a former police officer, and he also was an accident investigator. He did the driver's ed school, and then he would go out and investigate car accidents. And in the brochures and the literature, there were some pictures of him investigating, and he even explained a little how they do it. And he said it takes a lot of math, a lot of trigonometry, because you're figuring angles, and takes some physics and figuring speeds and that sort of thing. And he said he can just about figure right down to, I forgot how, within centimeters, where a collision of two cars collided and maybe went ahead another 10 or 15 feet. He could figure out just about where the two collided, and that could go towards figuring out who was at fault, if that's a question. And so you can get to the truth of it, but it might take a little while. There's a little while, and while we are having to dig for truth and do our research, do our homework, that's not denying truth. It just takes us a while to find it. And the fact that truth can be elusive in some areas of life is a reason why maybe people believe true for you, but not for me. Too many people genuinely disagree about too many things for us to know the truth. Significant, almost irreconcilable differences in dimensions like religion, morality, politics, and a lot of these come down to opinion. Right now, this is 2025, Donald Trump is president. He's wanting to dismantle the Department of Education. Is that a good idea? Well, you and I could discuss that. We might be at polar opposite viewpoints on that. But that is opinion. That's really not got to do with truth. Now, does there exist in Washington an entity called the Department of Education? Yeah, it's there. That's truth. There's no denying that. And I can't remember the name. I think it's Vince McMahon of the World Wrestling Organization. I think it's his wife that's the Secretary of Education. Maybe wrong on that. But there is somebody with the title Secretary of Education. Should we have the Department of Homeland Security, or should we get rid of it and just let the Defense Department do that? Let's discuss it. That's opinion. Okay, there's not any truth there to be had. You may arrive. That's where you can be, okay, what you think is the best plan, I may think is a terrible idea, and vice versa. And so with differing premises, we get differing conclusions. Besides a lack of knowledge, differing underlying philosophical assumptions when we approach a problem can account for disagreements. And he talks about New Agers' perspective versus a Wiccan versus a Christian versus these different ideas. And Margot Adler wrote that thou art goddess, thou art God, divinity, inasmuch as within you as without. There's no such thing as sin. She was a New Ager. I don't know if she's still with us or not. But allegedly the solution to the human condition is getting in touch with the divine within us, and we are not God. Shirley MacLaine, I think, went down that road. I don't know if she still did. She's Warren Beatty's older sister, by the way, for those who didn't know. Of course, they're, I think, pretty well retired, and younger generations will have no idea who I'm talking about. So we'll move on. A Christian, however, sees sin and its consequent separation from a holy God as the source of the human problem. We don't need illumination, we need forgiveness. And that's the worldview that I take. We're all sinners, everybody. Donald Trump, yeah, he is too. So's Joe Biden, so's Kamala Harris, so is King Charles III, so is his family. We're all sinners who's standing before a sinless God. And so we have to deal with that situation. Now, a New Ager's not going to see it that way. So then we have to ask the relativists, why conclude that truth is relative? What if disagreement stems from lacking the full or bigger picture of objective reality? Disagreements may become because maybe there's new information on a given topic. You have it, I don't. And so let's talk about, okay, yeah, I see. I didn't know that this new formula had been discovered or that this new idea had come out. Yeah, I'm going to have to consider that and think about it. So to summarize, discerning truth is sometimes difficult, but it does not mean that it can't be discerned. Truth can be known. Now, jumping back here to the first point, that discerning truth is sometimes difficult doesn't mean truth doesn't exist or can't be discerned. That just popped into my head about Jesus praying to sanctify the disciples in the truth. Your word, God, speaking to God, is truth. There's truth for us right there. And sometimes finding Bible truth can be a little bit difficult to figure out, but it's there and we can learn it. Now, disagreement can result for a couple of reasons. One, people don't have full knowledge of a particular subject. Number two, having differing underlying assumptions about reality. That's where you got to be careful, speaking of full knowledge, of the internet. A lot of stuff out there on the internet, there's some good information. There's a lot of crap out there too. You got to be very careful. But one view of reality may still be true, which to the degree that it is true would mean others are not true. And disagreement does not say anything about an issue's truth or falsehood. Acknowledging the roots or context of a belief says nothing about whether or not it is correct. I acknowledge that Islam is in the world, but it does not mean that I agree with it or that I approve it. And this is something, acknowledging something is this, and I think we get this too from Bible critics, that acknowledging or recording something is the same thing as agreeing with it. Pestilence and war are in the world. I acknowledge that. It's there. Does it mean I agree with it? No. If I happen to know somebody who is a false teacher, and I have some names, big names come to mind. I think Max Lucado, for instance, is a false teacher. He was a faithful member of the Lord's Church at one time, but he's not. Now, does that mean that I may acknowledge, if I read a book of his, does that mean I'm acknowledging and extending fellowship and all this other stuff? No. Just means I'm reading the book. And he may have some points in there that I agree with him on. It does not mean, though, I'm giving him a full endorsement. And if beliefs are shaped by culture, then so is relativism. So relativism would be true accidentally, and thus couldn't be called knowledge. Are relativists really willing to say that no views are false? That, for instance, ethnic cleansing for the greater good isn't really wrong for some people? Relativism turns out to be a shallow refusal to think hard about things. Yeah, and I think agnosticism is kind of the same thing. It believes that there is a God out there somewhere, we just can't know about him, and long story short. But I think that's pretty lazy to do it that way. And then relativists believe that their view is true for all, that disagreement exists, and that relativism inexorably follows from their observations. So true or falsehood doesn't mean anything to the relativist. He can change their view as desired because nothing ultimately is false. So that will wrap it up for today. Next time, we'll look at chapters 3 and 4. You're just using Western logic, and who are you to judge others? We'll take a look at those on our next installment. In the meantime, for Tuesday, let's pray for the church. Pray for the members of the local church, Christians and congregations, wherever they are. So we thank you, Lord, for today. We thank you for giving us another day, and especially in some parts of the country, it's going to be a heat index, Lord. Just pray for people to be safe. Pray for the church to be safe. Pray for the church to be bold in its proclamation of the truth. We want to pray, Lord, that you'll help congregations and individual Christians to understand there is a truth, that you have given it to us, and that truth of the gospel, of the saving message of Jesus, needs to be out there for everybody. I want to pray for the church universally, Lord, to stand firm. I want to pray for local churches, Lord, that they may also grow in their knowledge and in the spiritual truths of the scriptures. Thank you for Jesus. Thank you for all that we have through him. In Jesus' name, amen. So leave your comments, your feedback, your questions in the comment section below. That is going to wrap it up for today. Thanks for being here. Hope everybody has a blessed Tuesday. Be good to yourself, and if you possibly can, be good to somebody else. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.